Long before the first European ships cut across the Atlantic, before borders and flags divided the land, the vast expanse of North America was home to millions of indigenous people whose ancestors had walked these lands for over 10,000 years. From the icy tundra of Alaska to the humid wetlands of Florida, from the high mesas of the Southwest to the endless plains stretching into the horizon, Native Americans lived in harmony with nature, guided by deep spiritual beliefs and rich traditions that connected them to the earth, sky, and all living things. Each tribe, each nation, had its own way of life, its own language, and its own sacred stories explaining the creation of the world and the bond between humans and nature. The earliest native societies were not primitive wanderers, as later colonizers falsely claimed, but builders, farmers, and thinkers. The Mississippian culture along the great rivers constructed enormous earthen mounds and thriving trade networks that stretched thousands of miles. Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, rose as one of the largest cities in pre-Columbian North America, filled with ceremonial plazas, astronomically aligned temples, and tens of thousands of inhabitants. To the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built remarkable stone dwellings in the cliffs of Mesa Verde and vast cities like Chaco Canyon, where astronomical precision met religious devotion. In the dense forests of the northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy united multiple nations under a democratic system that would later inspire aspects of the U.S. Constitution. Across the continent, native societies thrived in balance with their environments, sustaining their people through hunting, farming, and fishing guided by spiritual respect for the natural world. When Europeans first set foot on American soil in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they entered a world far older than their own. To the native people, these strangers with strange clothes, weapons, and languages seemed to have come from another realm. Early contact was often cautious and curious. In some areas, trade brought mutual benefit. Native people offered furs, maize, and knowledge of the land. Europeans brought metal tools, beads, and guns. But beneath the surface of this fragile exchange lay an imbalance that would soon erupt into conflict. The arrival of Europeans was not just the coming of explorers but the arrival of disease, greed, and conquest. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept across the continent like invisible armies, wiping out entire villages and nations before direct contact even occurred. For tribes who survived, the trauma of loss was immense. The elders, who held oral histories and knowledge, perished in great numbers. In many ways, the epidemics were the first wave of colonization, softening resistance to the later waves of settlers and soldiers. As European powers, Spain, France, England, and later the United States, expanded their territories. The 20th century began with Native America standing at a crossroads between survival and disappearance. The old ways had been outlawed, the languages silenced, and the children scattered in boarding schools. But beneath the weight of colonization, a quiet resistance stirred. Elders still sang in secret, speaking to the spirits of the land in hushed tones. Ceremonies that had been banned were carried out under the cover of night. The people had endured wars, starvation, and removal, yet the heart of native identity, the deep connection to land, spirit, and community, refused to die. As the new century dawned, the federal government pursued a policy it called assimilation, a strategy meant to transform Native Americans into model American citizens by erasing everything that made them indigenous. The 1887 Dawes Act had already divided communal tribal lands into private plots, with any surplus sold to white settlers. By 1930, Native Americans had lost more than two-thirds of the lands they once held. Those who tried to farm the dry soil of their allotted plots faced poverty and hunger. The government promised civilization but delivered dependency. Boarding schools became the sharpest weapon in this campaign of assimilation. Institutions like Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, founded by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, took native children from their families and stripped them of their names, hair, language, and identity. They were forced to dress like Europeans, speak only English, and adopt Christian practices. Punishments for speaking tribal languages were brutal. Generations grew up disconnected from their culture, believing they had to choose between being native or being accepted by society. And yet, even within those schools, resilience took root. Children whispered traditional words to each other at night, sang forbidden songs softly in the dark, and carried home fragments of the culture that others tried to erase. In 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, granting Native Americans U.S. citizenship. While it seemed like progress, the gesture was hollow for many. Citizenship did not bring equality, voting rights, or an end to exploitation. It merely folded Native people into a system that continued to deny them autonomy. The same government that called them citizens also controlled their lands, their schools, and their futures. A new era began during the Great Depression when President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration introduced the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, also known as the Indian New Deal. It was a turning point. The act aimed to end allotment and restore a measure of self-governance to tribes. For the first time in decades, Native people were encouraged to form their own governments, manage their lands, and revive aspects of traditional culture. Though imperfect and limited, it offered a glimmer of renewal. In many communities, elders and leaders saw it as an opportunity to rebuild what ha. As the 21st century opened, Native America entered an age of revival, an era shaped by memory, struggle, and renewal. The long shadow of colonization still lingered, but the people who had once been told they were vanishing were instead rebuilding nations, reclaiming languages, and reawakening the spirits of their ancestors. Across the continent, from the deserts of the Southwest to the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the heartbeat of the drum continued to echo, reminding the world that the first peoples of this land had never left. The new century brought both promise and pain. Many Native nations began asserting their sovereignty more forcefully, using courts, legislation, and international law to defend what remained of their homelands and resources. Tribal governments grew more sophisticated, forming partnerships in business, education, and environmental protection. The same communities that once depended on federal agents now created their own schools, clinics, and law enforcement systems. The principle of self-determination, won through decades of activism, became the foundation of a new Native renaissance. Yet the legacy of poverty and displacement remained real. In many reservations, unemployment was high, healthcare was underfunded, and young people struggled with the weight of intergenerational trauma. The scars left by boarding schools still ran deep. Many elders carried the memories of children who never came home from those institutions, stories that were only beginning to surface publicly in the 2010s and 2020s. Unmarked graves found near former schools in the US and Canada forced nations to confront a history long buried beneath silence. The grief was overwhelming, but it also sparked healing movements. Communities held memorial walks, language vigils, and ceremonies to honor the lost children, reclaiming not just their names but their spirits. At the same time, Native voices began to rise in every sphere of modern life. Universities saw a new generation of indigenous scholars rewriting history from their own perspectives. Artists and filmmakers explored the beauty and complexity of Native life, far beyond the stereotypes of Hollywood. The 1998 film Smoke Signals, the poetry of Joy Harjo, who became the first Native American U.S. Poet Laureate, and the paintings of modern artists like John Quick-to-See Smith showed that Native creativity could bridge ancient traditions and contemporary struggles. In music, the blending of powwow drums with hip-hop beats gave birth to a new style of indigenous expression, reminding youth that they could be modern without losing who they were. The environmental movement became another front of Native leadership. For centuries, indigenous peoples had warned of the consequences of disrespecting the earth. In the 21st century, as climate change and industrial exploitation threatened water and land, those teachings became prophetic. Tribes across North America fought oil pipelines, mining pro